It's one of the darkest pages in the history of the French capital of Paris. A scandal that erupted during the reign of Louis XIV. A mixture of plots, murders, an attempt on the king's life, poisonings, black masses, and sacrificed children. It's called the Affair of the Poisons.
The Affair of the Poisons is probably one of the biggest criminal cases of all time.
With this case, did Louis XIV's kingdom plunge into murderous madness? How can we distinguish between truth and legend? To find out, it's here in Paris that we must investigate. I'm Jean-Marc Léry. I've devoted my life to understanding Paris's history, studying its secrets, and wandering its maze of streets. The city holds many centuries-old mysteries. Often these cases are dismissed as occult phenomena, myths, legends, or popular beliefs. Things have happened here, though. There are facts, consistencies, and bona fide witnesses. Historians, scientists, and investigators of all sorts have been unable to solve them. It is time to reveal the most plausible theories and to get as close as possible to the truth. Here's Paris, as you've never seen it before. January 1681, the height of Louis XIV's reign. Paris was going through one of the most disconcerting episodes in its history. One of the darkest, too. One which would send an unprecedented shockwave through society, the Affair of the Poisons. The great letter writer of the day, the Marquise de Sévigné, described the French court as being in stupefaction, turmoil, and chaos. The Affair of the Poisons was a series of scandals and poisonings that turned the court of the Sun King upside down. Many died in terrifying conditions. Black masses were held, invoking Satan. Rites were carried out on human bodies, and young children were sacrificed. The king himself was forced to intervene. This affair was a thriller, a real-life historical game of Cluedo, but with even more characters. One of the biggest criminal cases of all time. But what or who was behind it? However dark the truth is, the veil of mystery needs to be lifted. The Affair of the Poisons started with the uncovering of a first poisoner. And she wasn't just anyone. On July 17th, 1676, at 6 in the evening, hundreds of Parisians lined the streets to watch the passing of a cart which from Châtelet Jail via Notre Dame Cathedral took the Marquise de Brinvilliers to the scaffold on the Place de Grève, where Paris's City Hall stands today. The Marquise de Brinvilliers was the daughter of nobles on both sides. She was accused of poisoning her father and brothers and attempting to poison her sister and niece, along with other victims, the number of whom remains unknown. The Marquise never confessed as to why. Nobody could have imagined a woman of the nobility behaving in such a way. It came as a massive shock to society of the day and questioned its very foundations. A line had been crossed. But this was only the start. heralding an even more terrible period to come. During the second half of the 17th century, Paris was gripped by psychosis. All kinds of new rogues abounded within the French capital. Charlatans, poisoners, alchemists, love potion sellers, fortune tellers, gold diggers, phony priests, and real priests who officiated at black masses. And they all offered their services to a society with two faces. On one side, the pomp and radiance of Louis XIV's reign. On the other, darkness and evil. The world of the forces of evil grew to match in strength the forces of good. Black magic and sorcery blighted people of all backgrounds, from the common people to aristocrats and the court.
Anxiety reigned in every household. Fathers distrusted their children, wives their husbands, grandmothers their grandchildren. People were living in high anxiety and complete turmoil. There was a real psychosis about poison. Despite the flourishing arts, literature, and the radiance of French culture, in the back alleys of Paris it was still the Middle Ages. There were about 400 witches and warlocks active in the capital, which had a population of 600,000.
Hundreds of witches and warlocks would help to launch a new deadly fashion in the streets of Paris, the concocting of poisons with various substances and different properties.
In the 17th century, when looking for poisons, you could choose substances either of plant origin or mineral origin. Among the plants were aconite, an excellent, very strong poison, belladonna, henbane, nightshade, and devil's trumpet, not forgetting hemlock, which has been known since antiquity. And among the minerals were arsenic and, of course, corrosive sublimate, the favorite poison of the Marquise de Brinvilliers.
Other poisons were concocted to act as aphrodisiacs. These were made with urine, sperm, menstrual blood, nail clippings, toad spittle, and cantharides, commonly known as Spanish fly.
The Spanish fly isn't a fly at all, but the beautiful green beetle, cantharides. It was used to provoke an erection, but an erection which was very painful and which caused blood in the urine as a side effect. So it was extremely toxic, and overuse led to a very painful death. But you could obtain this dramatic poison anywhere, because in the country, peasants could find the beetles very easily.
This host of poisons freely on sale came to the attention of the Paris chief of police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, who would become one of the key figures in the affair of the poisons. Louis XIV trusted him entirely and placed him in charge of the investigation into the Marquise de Brinvilliers.
La Reynie was a precursor of all the famous policemen who followed him, like Fouché, Vidocq, in the mobile police unit. In fact, La Reynie was the founding father of the modern police force as the first lieutenant general of police.
He was the first lieutenant general of police of Paris, and he organized an office which was the ancestor of today's prefecture of police. There's even a plaque to commemorate him at the main entrance of the prefecture of the police facing Notre Dame Cathedral.
He had to deal with both crime and the city itself, its supplies, policing, markets, fairs, traffic, fighting epidemics, and fires. That's why he was so different from his successors, who only had to deal with crime.
He wasn't only the police chief, but a kind of governor of the city, and that's why he stands out. Before that, Paris's back streets were like cutthroat alleys, and going out at night in Paris was suicide. Street lighting is essential for a city's security, so he had Paris lit up correctly and regularly, which is what earned it the name of the City of Light. He was active in all areas of the city's management, and not just in the police.
In September 1677, an anonymous letter describing a plot to kill the king with white powder was left in a confessional of the Jesuit abbey on the Rue Saint-Antoine. L'Araignée smelled a rat. For several months, he sent his detectives into the notorious district of Saint-Denis, where the poisons trade was plied. They made arrests, interrogated suspects, and tortured them. The king's ministers, followed by the king himself, were stunned to learn that several hundred people in Paris were making and selling deadly poisons with impunity. They realized the cases of poisoning hadn't stopped with the execution of the Marquise de Brinvilliers. L'Araignè's investigation would eventually lead to one of the worst serial killers in French history. Catherine Dehaye, aka La Voisin, lived and worked in her store at 23 to 25 Rue Beauregard in the capital's 2nd arrondissement. La Voisin presented herself as a former midwife, but she also practiced abortions, read cards, and told fortunes. At the same time, as a good Christian, she would dedicate herself to novenas, devotional prayers repeated for 9 consecutive days. La Voisin also sold lotions, potions, ointments, and poisons of all sorts. Members of the Paris upper class, mostly ladies, visited her dispensary to get rid of an overbearing husband, a bothersome lover, or a rival in love.
It was a real business. La Voisin was a businesswoman. She ran a company with employees, mostly women. She made money, and she had few morals or scruples.
She also carried out serial abortions. She burned 2,500 fetuses in an oven. When she was asked why she had that oven, she said, "To make my little pâtés."
La Voisin was a vile creature. It's not caricaturing. She was an abominable person.
From then on, every death was suspicious. The affair grew to such a scale that on April the 7th, 1679, Louis XIV asked l'Araignée to reopen the Chambre Ardente, the burning chamber, an exceptional court created a century earlier to judge crimes of state. The burning chamber tried 442 people, issued 319 arrest warrants, and made 104 judgments, including 30 acquittals, 36 death sentences, 34 banishments from the kingdom, and 4 sentences to the galleys. Arrested in 1679, La Voisin was burned at the stake 2 years later on the Place de Grève. Everyone thought the case was closed, but far from it. La Voisin's daughter, also interrogated by l'Araignè's men, made some sensational revelations. She accused a number of figures in the king's entourage. But one name stood out, Madame de Montespan. Françoise Athénéis de Rochechouart de Mortemart, Marquise de Montespan, was one of the most beautiful women at court. Intelligent, cultured, spiritual, she had been born into one of France's most illustrious families. She was Louis XIV's royal mistress and mother to 7 of his children. A young woman in her service, Mademoiselle des Œillets, was said to have made numerous visits to La Voisin's dispensary. Madame de Montespan was believed by some to be behind the suspicious death of the king's new young mistress, Mademoiselle de Fontanges. Even worse, Madame de Montespan apparently wanted to poison the king himself for breaking her heart. She was also suspected of being the instigator of black masses in connivance with Etienne Guibourg, a defrocked priest. Women lay naked, a black candle in each hand, on what constituted the altar of these macabre masses. Babies had their throats slit on these women's stomachs. Their blood was poured into a chalice. Satan was then invoked so that a good deed or bad deed towards another be fulfilled. It's said that next, the baby's entrails and heart were collected for the making of poisons. As crazy as it might sound or read, these black masses did exist. And undoubtedly, so did trafficking in abandoned newborns destined for these unimaginable rituals. In June of 1681, La Reynie had had Etienne Guibourg arrested. He was interrogated and tortured. Several of his statements pointed to Madame de Montespan. Important figures were worried. The affair fanned the flames of rivalry between 2 famous ministers of the king, the Marquis de Louvois and Jean-Baptiste Colbert. It was then that Louis XIV brought an abrupt end to proceedings. He closed the burning chamber and gave the order for everything to disappear. Hundreds of pages of court records, correspondence, statements and reports. Was Louis XIV trying to protect his mistress? The truth would come out by chance years later. In about 1850, the chief librarian at the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal, François Ravesson, decided to have his parquet renewed. And when the boards were removed, he discovered part of the archives of the Bastille, and notably the personal notes of La Reynie, which he had written outside of the proceedings. For historians, this was a treasure trove.
We owe
Ravesson our gratitude because as all the court paperwork had been burned by order of Louis XIV and under his strict control, if historians and archivists didn't have at their disposal the private notes of La Reynie, we would know a whole lot less about this affair that has such an important place in the history of France. I think we can sum up what he did as that of a serious public servant, keeping very precise records of a crucial episode in history.
Louis XIV wanted to hush up the affair. Under his orders, those who had mentioned Madame de Montespan in their statements were never brought to trial. Likewise, those who had spoken of black masses and spells. They were locked in towers in the provinces, so they would be simply forgotten. But a big question remains. What was the extent of Madame de Montespan's guilt? Could she have attempted to poison Mademoiselle de Fontanges, the king's new mistress? Or even the king himself?
The affair of the poisons did indeed reveal Mademoiselle de Fontanges had been the victim of attempted poisonings. The trouble is, after studying the timeline of events, when Voisin's accomplices went to the apartment of Mademoiselle de Fontanges with poisoned fabrics, at that moment in time, Madame de Montespan didn't know yet that the young Fontanges was the king's mistress. So chronologically, the case against her doesn't hold up. There was an attempted poisoning, but Madame de Montespan wasn't involved in it.
The accusations of buying love potions and other things so as to keep the king's love are well-founded. But wanting to poison the king? That's a ridiculous hypothesis. It's like biting the hand that feeds you.
Did Madame de Montespan take part in black masses? It's possible. Etienne Guibourg said, "I said a mass over the body of a young woman I was told was Madame de Montespan. Her face was covered in veils. Was it her? Did she commission the masses?" Here there's some doubt, the benefit of which goes to Madame de Montespan.
The role of Madame de Montespan's chambermaid, Mademoiselle des Oeillets, is much less clear-cut. She undoubtedly visited Voisin. It was even said that a mysterious English lord had given her money to pay for a black mass officiated by Guibourg. But trying to poison Louis XIV when she was in fact his secret mistress and mother to a daughter by him?
She wanted the king to recognize her daughter, to have her legitimized. But the king refused. So one might suppose that Mademoiselle des Oeillets, who knew of her mistress's dealings with Voisin, continued buying love potions and aphrodisiacs for her own purposes, which were then given to the king unwittingly by Madame de Montespan. And perhaps, instead of an aphrodisiac, it was poison.
The complex investigation that was the affair of the poisons, this huge historical criminal case, is now partly solved. Madame de Montespan dabbled in the world of spells and aphrodisiacs, but never set out to assassinate Louis XIV. However, Mademoiselle des Oeillets' involvement seems real enough. The entire network of witches and poisoners was wiped out, even though numerous important figures slipped through the net. But at least one benefit was to come of the affair. On July 31st, 1682, the French Parliament issued an epoch-making edict. All magical practices would be severely punished, and only scientists had the right to run a laboratory. The page of the poisons had turned, even though this mystery will forever have its grey areas.
Well, we are still terrified today of this affair, with its long line of witches, warlocks, black masses, and so on. We must remember that these practices didn't disappear with the reign of Louis XIV, and that they still exist today. We don't live in an entirely rational era. However much technology there is still practices today which go back to ancient times, in which in our eyes are totally reprehensible. And so we need to ask questions.
The affair of the poisons will always be a blot on the shimmering reign of Louis XIV, the sun and its eclipse, the glory and the folly. It also revealed another face of France's capital city and its taste for the world of darkness and the occult. But Paris has other mysteries. The clues and keys to these enigmas are to be found in old books, lost in the capital's libraries, in the city's streets or beneath its buildings, by the light of a candle or in the dead of night, by cross-checking documents, archives, and records. Paris has not yet revealed all of its secrets.